with FFA, the naming and renaming of school facilities. And so I'm not sure who's going to start first, but I will pass the mic over to whoever's starting us next.
Well, I think Dr. Brooks said they might be waiting for you to tell them who's going to start.
Is that the case? Y'all want me to pick, or y'all didn't? Okay, so we're going to start in order.
Gina.
We have KCA on the agenda first, Commissioner Brooks.
Great.
I'm coming off mute. Hi, everybody. You'd like us to go ahead and get started with KCA?
Yes, Chief Hightower, thank you so much.
Absolutely. So good afternoon, everybody. My team is here, to present on our plan for KCA. This is a new thing that we're doing this year with Policy Committee. Rather than coming to you with first reader and then telling you what we've done around engagement and that kind of thing, we're trying something new here today, where we are bringing to you our plan for how we intend to do stakeholder engagement, frankly, as well as highlight the areas of the current KCA policy we'd like to work on, or things we think are problematic or need to be improved. And we're going to highlight those items for you as well, along with a timeline. So Jessica Lawrence, my policies specialist on our team, is working on this diligently, and I'm going to turn it over to Jessica to kick us off. And I'll be here to answer any questions as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Chief Hightower, and hello, everyone. Let's jump right in. And so our agenda for today is quite simple. Just going to walk you through the outcomes for the policy review process, as well as stakeholder engagement, our vision, theory of action, and strategy for our work. We'll mention a little bit about what's in the existing policy and some new recommendations. And we'll get into the stakeholder engagement process and the many ways that the community, as well as partners, parents, families, everyone that touches our work will have to be able to be part of it. And then we'll talk about the timeline and next steps. And so in terms of the goals and outcomes for the review process, we've recognized that there must be essential conditions and processes and systems in place to ensure that we are building and sustaining effective and strong partnerships. So at a high level, we want to make sure that before we start, we want to inform and build awareness of our new family and community engagement structure and our division. And really unpack for all stakeholders the policy review process and the multiple ways that they can be part of it. We want to elevate stakeholder voice and decision making in this policy review process. We want to establish a common definition for our work that is reflective of all stakeholders and their needs. And we want to align the policy implementation strategies in the revisions to evidence-based practices and our new structure. We want to engage and honor all families as co-creators and key partners and advocates in our work. And we want to also make sure that we're aligning our implementation strategies to our equity policy. And so what drives our work? We like to begin all of our presentations with a quick touch on what we do and why we do it. We have a call to action. And that's to work collaboratively with our families and stakeholders to ensure that they are equipped with the knowledge, tools, and networks to become stronger partners in the education of their children. It means that we have to work hard to improve experiences at both the district and school level, and that's through our supports to schools. It means that we show through our actions and our supports that we believe and care about our families. And lastly, we create access points for information sharing that is two-way. And with this in mind, our mission and vision is very clear, and our theory of action is simple. We know that if there are authentic and strategic opportunities for collaboration with stakeholders, and if we're aligning that work to our district's academic priorities, we will have engagement that is linked to the success of our students and in our schools. Our work is also guided by the dual capacity building framework for family school partnerships. This was created by Dr. Karen Mapp in partnership with experts, parent leaders, and educators from across the country. And this logic model is really important because it addresses the challenges that we know are part of this work. Families and staff just aren't clear on how we should be partnering to support our schools and to build community and linking engagement to student success. And so we haven't built their capacity in these areas, and to do so, there has to be essential conditions to sustain our work. And there has to be policy and program goals. And that's why we're here today. We're very excited about the approach to revising our FCE policy. And if all of these things are in play, our teachers, schools, and families are able to work together to support effective partnerships that support student learning. And so now I'd like to talk about the current policy, some of the new recommendations, and the review process. I want to do a quick touch on the historical context and background for the existing policy. It was established in 2009. I remember I wasn't working for the district at the time, but I remember as a parent being engaged in information sessions and really being excited about joining my school's school family council. That was really important to me. It was a major kickoff. It was a new thing that, you know, we were really clear on what the roles and responsibilities of stakeholders in schools were for family and community engagement. And this policy really grounded our district in what family and community engagement could look like and what should be happening. In comparison to other districts across the country, I'll note that our policy is one of the most robust policies for this work. It's studied at Harvard University's Graduate School of Education as a roadmap for what districts want to do and how they should scale around FCE. In this policy, we're very proud that we've established school family councils as a requirement in every school. Something that's really unique to Baltimore is that we have a principal selection process and budget engagement. These policy mandates and implementation strategies are very powerful. And so a lot has been done, but we know that we need to do more. We know that our schools need our support, coaching, guidance, and collaboration. And many of our parents and families and staff even just need to know what their rights and responsibilities are for building strong, trusting relationships with families and strengthening homeschool partnerships. And so we're calling out in this process early on and right now in this moment that there are gaps, and we're hopeful that through this review process that we can co-create the implementation strategies that reflect the unique needs and voices and experiences of all families and stakeholders. And so our work looks different. We're a different team. Our families have different needs than they had back in 2009. And so we hope to make sure that all of that is reflected in this process. And so based on what we've learned in the last few years and more recently, these recommended focus areas are where we feel like we need to scale and revise in the policy. We have a new strategy for family and community engagement that wasn't around at the time that this policy was developed. I'll just quickly mention that at the time, folks were using the 6 types of involvement. And that was a great approach to the work, but it has to be two-way and it has to be reflective of the unique needs of our families. And our structure is extremely different right now. We have to realign our policy to the existing research for family and community engagement, as well as some of the bodies of work that we own. And so we have a youth engagement specialist, and there is a strong emphasis on making sure that our schools are clear on what youth and adult partnerships look like. Evaluation and assessment is huge for continuous improvement. What are the indicators and practices that we're using to monitor our effectiveness? And our schools clear on what that looks like. We have multilingual engagement, neighborhood and community relations, our community school strategy. We also know that it's important to make sure that we're linking everything that we do around our work to building strong academic relationships with parents, so that they're all clear on what are the milestones that young people should have, and that parents feel confident in supporting that with their child's teacher and in their schools. And then we also want to make sure that we're targeting our capacity building efforts to align to our data. And so those are just some of the early focus areas that we know we're really interested in bringing the policy up to speed on. And so in terms of equity, we really want to make sure that the review process considers some of the standards and mandates in our equity policy. We believe that it's one of the most important components of the review process in making sure that our work is aligned. The impact on race and educational equity and how families connect within our schools and to their children's experience has to anchor this process. And so when we go out to hear from families, particularly when we're engaging our students and families and staff of color, we're going in knowing and acknowledging that there are inequitable practices, systems, and structures that have harmed our families and students in our communities. And so we're using the guiding questions for equity to apply an equity lens to everything that we do in all phases of the review process. And so we understand these challenges and barriers and what it may take to be able to do that. And most importantly, we just want to make sure that when we're going out, that we're listening and we're being responsive to what we learn from our families and stakeholders. And so in our early planning and review of the policy, there are some areas where we already know that we have to align the revisions to the FCE policy too. And our training and PD is one of them, making sure that all of our capacity building activities are anchored in the equity policy. Really understanding and knowing that our communication tactics and engagement strategies are authentic and equitable in practice. And making sure that our families aren't just stakeholders that we go out and get feedback from, but really making sure that we're taking what we learn and using it and seeing them as co-creators of whatever strategies or policies that we come up with. Our families have assets and we can learn a lot from them. And so that's our approach with this. And we also want to make sure that we're ensuring that our families feel safe and welcome in their school communities. And so we have a responsibility to be responsive. And so we just wanted to call out that these are some of the considerations that we are recognizing and taking as we go through this process. And so now we'll talk about the stakeholder engagement and feedback strategy in the review process for the policy. And so there are a lot of stakeholders that are connected to our work, and we have to touch all of them. This graphic is what we refer to as our ecosystem for family and community engagement. It includes all groups. We know that we have to touch parent advocacy groups, our parents and families from different school types and different neighborhoods and community groups. Students have a huge part in what our work looks like in our department right now, understanding what youth and adult partnerships look like. We know that we have to consult experts and national leaders in this work to make sure that we're aligning to what the research says about family and community engagement. We have to hear from district staff and find out what they need in order to be able to carry out the implementation strategies and mandates and the revisions. And we also want to make sure we're touching our principals, staff, and teachers, as well as our community partners, lead agencies, grassroots organizations, and nonprofit agencies. And I'll also call out that we are laser focused on reaching our marginalized and underserved parent groups. That would include focus areas around like special education, our homeless families, early learners, immigrants, and newcomers have to see themselves in this review process and be part of the feedback that we collect. And so we understand that there may be barriers to engaging all of these stakeholder groups. And this is a challenging time for everyone. For example, the current climate, stakeholder preferences for reopening, experiences with virtual learning. We know that power dynamics is a real thing right now. There's uncertainty because of the pandemic. There's capacity and barriers to information sharing. Traditionally, we'd be out and on the ground, hosting meetings in person. And so some of those things we're unable to do right now. And then survey fatigue is a real thing. There are competing priorities. There are schools that are getting feedback from families. So we want to be mindful and sensitive to that. And in doing so, we recognize that these are the barriers, but we have some solutions in terms of the way in which we're going to collect feedback from families and making sure that there are multiple touch points to do so. And so this graphic is kind of like a snapshot of the many different ways that stakeholders in this process can weigh in, and we can elevate their voices and collect feedback from them. And so we use the equity questions to develop our engagement methods. We considered the challenges, and we're hoping that some of these options will eliminate those barriers as much as we can. And so there's an equitable approach. We want to make sure that it's not one way. And with these different approaches, we're considering technical barriers, language and cultural factors, whether it's virtual or in person. We have virtual stories. We know that digital engagement and stakeholder engagement in digital spaces is a real thing now. And we have to use that as an opportunity to hear from our families. Where we can and where it's safe, we'll be doing in-person pop-ups and small group meetings. We have virtual forums, interviews, polls and surveys, and focus groups. And so these are just some of the many ways that our families can share their voice and give us input on the policy review process. And so we'll look at the timeline and next steps right now. And this graphic is kind of like the life cycle of the policy review process and our timeline. We have been planning for quite some time, as you can see in the second column. I'll just skip ahead really quick because we've been working on this since May of in the spring and getting feedback. We have a lot of feedback from families, from our listening tours, our survey results, and we're evaluating and assessing that information right now. We're doing research on what the standards are for our work. And we're also doing a mini tour where we're doing small group virtual meetings with parent advocacy groups and schools to talk about this process and to let stakeholders know that it's coming. And this really is about coalition building, making sure that folks are aware that this is happening and how they can participate. And so in terms of our stakeholder engagement and input, we're hoping to have a lot of opportunities for these strategies between now and February. And then between January and February, conducting an analysis of that feedback and using it to make updates to the policy. And then next, the final round of stakeholder feedback and edits, we hope to be able to broadly promote the revisions and create access points for feedback on what we've heard from families. We want to go back and make sure that what they said they wanted to see and the implementation strategies align to what we actually heard from families. And then lastly, our goal is to have approval in late May of the policy. And so looking ahead, I mentioned earlier that we know we've done some surveys and we know that a lot of our stakeholders, many of them don't know that there is a policy for this work that helps to guide what this looks like across our schools. And so we're being really thoughtful about that. And we're working right now to develop a comprehensive information sharing and implementation campaign. We want to make sure that there's professional development and training for all stakeholders. So that's beyond school teams and staff, but anyone in that graphic, all of those stakeholders, everyone needs to be on the same page on the supports and the policy mandates. And then we want to partner with external stakeholders and parent advocacy groups to lead implementation and provide ongoing learning opportunities throughout implementation of the policy for the following school year. And then lastly, I just wanted to share that we vetted our engagement approach and review process with PCAB, PTA, and some other parent advocacy groups and stakeholders. We're very excited to be hosting our first citywide forum for families this Thursday, December the 17th, in partnership with PCAB. We've already collected a lot of data. We're using it to drive our planning and to implement some of the things I mentioned earlier. And we're working with BTU to revise our school family council guidance. That's a real thing, and we've heard from a lot of families that they just want to understand the decision-making process and those opportunities that are available to them. And so we're working in partnership with a variety of stakeholder groups, teachers, partners, our community schools coordinators to get this done. And so next, I'd like to share that we're also working with the Office of Differentiated Learning to evaluate and assess English learner family engagement. There's a survey out right now for teachers to just get feedback from them on what kinds of supports they need to be able to strengthen family engagement with that stakeholder group. And we'll also be doing the same thing with our families. And we're establishing an FCE advisory committee to serve as a guide and implementation partner throughout the entire process. And then we hope to present a draft of the policy on February the 16th. And so that concludes my presentation. And please let us know if you have any questions here.
Thank you so much for the very thoughtful presentation. So I'm going to open it up to our commissioners for questions. Any questions for Ms. Lawrence? Thoughts, feedback, etc.
Well, is that for me? You asked me that question? Yes, I thought the presentation was outstanding. Of course, I may be a little jaded. That is my that's my department there, but it was excellent, well thought out. I think it was comprehensive. I think it made sense. I think it's based on research. I'm very impressed. I mean, I'm in that department, but as ombudsman, I'm just not quite as involved in the development of those kinds of things, but I could relate that to what I do as ombudsman. So I thought it was excellent.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. We were trying to get some feedback from the commissioners on the presentation. Oh. Jessica Lawrence.
Okay, nope, I'm so sorry.
I'm so glad that you are clapping for your colleagues.
Yes.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
It's okay.
They have the same last name. That's what happened.
Yeah.
Calling her out.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Thank you, Karen, for shout outs. I appreciate
Thank you.
Yes. Commissioner McFadden.
Thank you, Dr. Brooks, and thank you to Ms. Lawrence, Jessica Lawrence, for the presentation. I'm really encouraged by the work that is going into this thought process and into the policy development. And it seems like there is quite a collaborative approach happening with this particular policy development. So I just want to say thank you and appreciate you and the team and everyone that's been working on putting this together. I loved when you said co-creators of programs and policies, bringing our parents and our families and our community into that process, but creating a space that is welcoming and equitable for them to feel valued and for us to actually not just ensure that they feel valued, but make sure that they are valued. Their
Yeah.
words, their contributions are valued. So I appreciate that. A couple of things that I was thinking about, not in particular to the very robust presentation that you provided on the plan around engagement and the work. I would like to just think about some ways to broaden our feedback and support reach with some partners. While we are developing the policy, I think it would be beneficial to solicit the feedback from our city council's education and youth committee.
Okay.
I'm not sure. I don't remember. I know that things are changing, so I don't remember who's in charge of that committee anymore. But I know that that could be a good resource for us to just collaborate with, because they are invested in the community. And of course, those folks that have been elected to serve communities, I know that they have a different type of reach than we do. So it would be nice to perhaps hear their perspective as we're developing this policy that benefits all of our children and families in the city. I think about the mayor's office of children and family success. I don't know if it is still in office or if it's going to evolve somehow, but I think that in the past, as that office was created, they've been a good partner with us. So I think we should continue that, especially as we're developing policy. I think we should be on the forefront. I mean, not the forefront, but be ahead of the feedback curve, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that feedback.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about Promise Heights and the University of Maryland, the School of Social Work.
We have them covered.
Okay,
we have them, yep. And I also mentioned that Chief Hike Hubbard is part, I believe, of the Children's Cabinet for the Mayor's Office of Children and Families. So that's like a direct link for us with that.
Perfect. I also think about SOMOS. SOMOS is a student-led organization, of course.
They're on the list.
When I think about, one of our fastest growing populations right now, I think they are true representatives and advocates of our students of Latin descent. So I think that we should certainly incorporate them. I'm just thinking, right? I'm also thinking about Baltimore Office of Promotion in the Arts. I don't know if you have any connections with them.
We do. Yep. They partner with us to host our back to school night. We've worked with them when we would have that at the Maryland Science Center. So we absolutely can do that. Yep.
I think just hearing their perspective on what we're thinking in terms of moving forward, not even just policy, but the policy just governs our action. So what do we believe and how are we moving forward? And so I think that's important. And then finally, I also had the thought of considering Erica Bridgefort. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Erica, but she's one of the founders of Baltimore Ceasefire.
Yeah.
And I know that they have a very beautiful but very meaningful way of connecting with communities that are often overlooked and often not necessarily supported as others. And I think that this could be a good time for us to bring Erica's perspective in to support the work that we're doing for children and families in the city as far as the school system is concerned.
Absolutely.
And then finally, when you mentioned the BTU being a part of the school family council, and I'll just also say school family councils are extremely important for me. And making sure that we explicitly outline what the makeup of those councils should look like, suggestions for what school family councils should look like, bringing in our business community within our school communities, on our family councils. What are the accountability measures for our school family councils? Are they actually participating in the budget process? Are they actively engaging throughout the course of the year, or is it just names on paper? And the reason why I'm saying that is because I know that for several of our schools currently, council is just name on paper and not necessarily folks that are looked at as partners to really make sure that our students are growing and that our communities are thriving as a result of these school family councils being active. But you mentioned the BTU helping with that. I would encourage also to bring in our school principals. And I'm sure that that's something that you all are thinking about. Yeah, but bring in pizzazz and those school principals who are kind of facilitating these school family councils. I think it would be beneficial to just make sure that their voices are incorporated in this development process. But I love the strategy that was presented to us today and the plan that was presented. And I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation up until May.
Thank you, Commissioner McFadden, for your suggestions. Go ahead, Tina. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just want to jump in quickly. I'm sorry, I was in the car. I'm going to a dentist appointment. Yay for me. But I want to just add that with GBC, we've created a partnership model where we're actually training GBC members to work with city schools robustly. And so we can incorporate that school family council ask into that work. We also hosted, just I want to make sure you all know, Monday, the first quarterly partner convening that we're going to do on a regular basis now, where any and all partners can come and hear directly from city schools about what we're doing. They can ask us questions, they can share their resources and opportunities, but we did flag for them the policy creation as well. And so we're going to incorporate all those partners into this feedback loop process. So I appreciate your comment, Commissioner McFadden, because it really does, we really are trying to be as comprehensive as we possibly can be. Jessica, we had 2,000 folks last summer that commented on the policy, and this time, what is our goal?
Oh gosh, our goal is always 100%, but at least hearing from all schools, I would say 10 to 20% of families from every school or program. Like that would give us, reliable data, to really say, hey, we're on the right track. And I'll also note that our results from the summer family survey for distance learning, we had a section in there on family and community engagement that is being used to drive the development of some of our early thinking in the revision process. And we had 17,000 families respond to that. So we're very excited about that feedback and the analysis around those results.
And I appreciate Jessica, Miss Lawrence, for mentioning the survey fatigue. That is a real thing. People being surveyed out. So I appreciate you calling that out, and it really says to me that we are thinking about multiple ways to really connect with people, to get information from people, and then also thinking about what information we actually are trying to get and how we're presenting that information, because it could be a survey, but if the survey is just if it's a whole bunch of questions, or if it is written in a way that may not necessarily connect with all of our families, I just think surveys, I get the fatigue. That's all I'm saying. I get the fatigue. But I appreciate you mentioning that. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner McFadden. Commissioner James, do you have thoughts, questions?
I do, if it's okay, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
So thank you for your presentation and for the work you've been doing. I want to give an extra shout out to Chief High Cupboard, who has been a part of the policy process on this side of the table, and understands how hard the prior committees work to make this process happen, where we can get stuff out in front of the public before it's drafted. We were able to do it with the equity policy, but I love that your leadership is really leaning into this public first perspective on the process. So thank you. To add to Commissioner McFadden's list of folks is the faith-based community, and where they're fitting in. If for no other reason than within the faith-based community, not only does it hit parts of neighborhoods that sometimes we miss, but it also is a rich volunteer pool. So helping both to get input from, but also use that process as an educational tool for those communities who might be interested in being of service to students. A couple of things that I'm hoping happen out of this. And one, I loved your highlighting the school family council. Again, to give a nod to what Commissioner McFadden was saying, that some of them are more functional and more invested than others. So hopefully part of the regulations of this will be providing specific guidance for those councils and expectations, as well as some accountability for principals and school leaders. But add to that list also, beyond the school family council, guidance and support around expectations of community involvement with the budgeting process, because that's one of those pieces we hand over to schools. And we provide some support, but if that could be sort of baked into this expectation of community engagement, might be helpful. And there's a couple other, beyond the school family council, there's things like the wellness committee that are mandated to be happening in every building. So as another issue, not of surveillance through this policy, but as another way of ensuring the community knows that these groups need to be assembled at schools, whether that community be principals, teachers, students, parents, or invested community members. So including sort of the budget and the wellness policy committee. Two possible sort of dashboardy ideas to come out of the regulations that I think would benefit the district at large. And one would be just a volunteer engagement dashboard. So if somebody moves into this community and says, you know what, I'm a volunteer for city schools, some place they can go to say, oh, here's the process, here's how you vet yourself to become an approved volunteer at X, Y, or Z level. If you're going to help facilitate a field trip, you need this certification or accreditation or sort of level of process you've gone through. If you're going to help with paint lines on a playground when no kids are there, you need this kind of a certification, so that people can readily find out how they can be of service to our community. Okay. And along with that, on that sort of same dashboard, a comprehensive list of who our partners are. Specifically our partners that are in service to students in after school and before school programs, or tutoring, volunteer programs in that respect. Again, places where the community might be able to get involved, that might be interested in getting involved without having to go and search and seek, without putting the burden of responsibility, responding in a day on principals, just to really help build out the robustness of what does it mean to engage with city schools. Because it doesn't always have to be going and sitting in the classroom and reading. It can be, but it also might be, working on campaigning for promotion, getting messaging out. It might be about contacting neighbors, about resources. Who knows? And right now, even I can say who knows, and I have a pretty good idea what we need. So having that ready for people. And then, so my question, and the question I'll leave you with is, what kind of metrics are you envisioning using to assess the impact of this policy? And as somebody who's been on the board for now, this is my 5th year, every single time we talk about, oh, we're going to, massively improve engagement and communication. And I think we make incremental steps, but I'm interested in seeing what are sort of the look for as you're looking as outcomes of this policy to know that it worked, and how can we as a board help you back map that to make sure those are included in the regulations?
Sure. Well, I can speak to one of the things that we're very proud of is our collaboration with OAA in revisioning our parent survey, and using that as sort of like a roadmap to hear directly from families around how they're experiencing family and community engagement, and what they would like to see in terms of, how they want to be engaged and how they are connecting with their schools around that. The second thing is that what we have right now is a family and community engagement self-assessment. And it's where we partner with schools and we ask them, where do you see yourself on a continuum of family and community engagement in terms of some of the focus areas that you mentioned? Partnerships. I will pivot to Chief I covered to talk a little bit about what you mentioned with the volunteer engagement and the dashboard. But we assess them and we ask them, how are you doing with decision making and advocacy? Do you have an organized parent group? How often do you meet? What are your capacity building opportunities that you offer for your staff and your families? If they're in a high school, one of the indicators that we look for schools to tell us, do you have a student that sits on your school family council? And so we can share that assessment with you. after this meeting, but in terms of like the metrics and what we're looking for, there is an FCE assessment. And then we also ask schools to share evidence of implementation with us. That's primarily for our Title I schools and the documentation that we require from them to assess their practices and look at what effective practice looks like. And so we use the dual capacity building framework as a roadmap and a guide for us to get that done. And one of the things that I don't have included in this presentation is that we're doing work right now as part of the policy review process, is to have a rubric for schools. You know, what does success look like? You know, it's one thing to have, as you said, meetings every month, but what's happening in those meetings? Can families actually see themselves in the planning and implementation and outcomes of those regular touches for decision making, whether it's the organized parent group or a school family council, and the wellness committee, as you mentioned. So all of those things are things that we need to shore up. I'm glad you all mentioned the regulations. That work will be included in what that looks like. Beyond the requirements. And I can certainly circle back and make sure you get a copy of the FCE assessment. We met about that earlier today to share some good news about the responses from schools. So.
Yes, and I just want to just jump in and just also to be mindful of our time and to keep us moving forward just a little bit. And so I just had a few reflections, and they don't need a response at the moment. I just wanted to note a thing, and then we can follow up with any additional questions, just to try to make sure we have ample time to be in discussion about the other two agenda items. One, just overall, thank you very much. I appreciated the presentation, and I think it's great. Two, I really appreciate the dual capacity framework, and I had the opportunity to hear Chief Hubbard talk about it in many times and many iterations since I've been on the board. And it's really good to see that to start emerging in the forefront of the work even more. And so I just really appreciate that. And I would just say one of the things, and I'm not sure how it's going to live or how it lives in the policy when it comes forward, the context in which even the dual capacity frameworks talks about trust and how do we begin to address issues of trust. And so when I'm thinking about policy in this particular policy, is there a way that we can begin to align, embed within the policy ways to address some of the common challenges that lead to sort of distrust of our system or our processes, et cetera, so that it can serve as a lens and possibly a pathway for other folks, especially looking to do more family community engagement across the district, and so that we'll have something that lives, that both acknowledges and says, and therefore we're going to use this particular strategy to overcome, whether it's the polling, whether it's the focus groups, or whatever iteration of that look like. I think that might be helpful as well. And the last thing, and I'm not even sure if it fits here, but I would love for us to, as we're thinking about this policy, that we could also be trying to think robustly around sort of how we support and train folks to, like you said, with that rubric, to actually do the in-depth work to understand how do you actually build community, how do you build strong connections, what are the things that break trust, what are the things that build them, so that we can have folks can have some guidance and some capacity building around that. And I'm pretty sure that's already in the shop in some capacity, but just wanted to name that as some things that came up for me as I was reading the policy or the presentation and so forth. So
thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you so much. I appreciate this beautiful presentation, and I'm looking forward to seeing it come back with the feedback.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So we're going to go ahead and have a presentation about the policy GBEBB, staff conduct and students. And so I will quiet myself and turn over the mic.
Thank you, Commissioner Brooks. I'm Jeremy Granskinner, Chief Human Capital Officer, and I will be joined in a moment by Jerome Jones, our Director of Labor Relations and Negotiations. We are here to talk about policy GBEBB, and I will also say at the outset that appreciation for Chief Josh Sivan in the legal office and Jane Ehrenfeld on his team, who've been close partners in the development of the draft policy and regulations here as well.
Oh, I'm sorry, Chief Grant Center. Can I jump in 1 second? I'm so sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
If you just want to frame, like we went over on time a little bit, but if you could just keep this to 20 minutes and then leave some more time so that we can get to the other presentation, I greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, sure. There are a couple of purposes here with the policy. So this slide talks about generally what policy GBEBB has been about, which is to set standards for our staff and how they maintain professional and ethical and respectful relationships in their role and interactions with students, and act as role models for students at all times. So it outlines how we expect our employees to conduct themselves. And the revisions that are reflected in this proposed policy and regulation also have several different purposes. So we want to make sure that the policy and its regulation align with new legal requirements since 2011 when the policy was first adopted. We want to more clearly incorporate the non-physical well-being that we are seeking for our students as we think about staff conduct. We want to emphasize the applicability of the policy to all sorts of electronic interactions that are numerous and more than what existed in 2011. We also, through some parts here, are looking to be really explicit about the types of improper behavior the policy is directing staff to avoid. And then we want to clarify the responsibilities for investigations into staff misconduct. The purpose statement in the policy itself reaffirms the board's commitment to the safety and well-being of students with respect to physical, mental, and emotional well-being, and then now also includes specific language indicating that this extends to use of technology in all interactions that happen electronically. And I think here, actually, because I'm the one sharing, I can't see if Mr. Jones is here, but Jerome, if you are here, you can step in here.
Yeah, so I'm Jerome Jones, Director of Labor Relations. And so the policy defines all the different things on the screen here: abuse, mental injury, maltreatment, neglect, sexual abuse, child abuse, dating, grooming, and so forth. And it also talks about staff, defines the staff in the policy. Jump, Jeremy, to the next slide. So the policy sets standards that we expect all employees to build positive relationships with students and to support learning while adhering to the highest ethical standards. It prohibits sexual misconduct or any other type of improper fraternization behavior between staff and students. And additionally, it directs staff not to entertain students, socialize with students, or spend excessive amount of time with students in such a manner as to reasonably create the impression of improper behavior. And this is a part of the policy where we really had to think through and push in about how does, since 2011, with the electronic means that we engage with students and family, how to set boundaries there, and in understanding that there is a role for that, especially if it wasn't apparent before. In the current pandemic, it really brings out the need to have engaged students in that forum but make sure that we're engaging in ways that are not improper and do not set the impression that they're improper. Revisions also, it prohibits staff from engaging in other inappropriate conduct with students. And while it provides illustrations, it is not a non-exhaustive list. But some of the things we talk about are discrimination against students or treat them unfairly or inequitably, bullying, harassment, intimidation, engaging in inappropriate verbal interactions with students, using personal email accounts, social media networking, and I will jump ahead. This is where we are really engaging both the teachers union and the principals unions to help us think through how to make sure that we give teachers and principals the tools electronically they need to stay engaged with students, but also set boundaries so that people understand when they potentially crossing those boundaries. And then we do not want staff to transport a student alone in a vehicle without prior written permission from a parent and guardian or school committee. It directs the CEO designee to produce and regularly update the employee code of conduct to outline appropriate boundaries for staff conduct with student, requires staff training regarding prevention, identification, and reporting of sexual misconduct and improper fraternization behavior. And this aligns, of course, with the law. And the policy continues to require an annual report to the board regarding the status and disposition of all cases of allegations of violations of this policy. GBEBBRA, the regulations, addresses communication and training related to the policy, screening of prospective staff, the duty and process of reporting violations of the policy, which have to align both with our legal requirements, and also we have other policies, specifically JLF, which talks about abuse. And so we have to make sure that these two policies are aligned, and talks about the duty of process for investigation procedures and responsibility, resolution of complaints, and prohibitions or recommendation for future employment when sexual misconduct is suspected or alleged. This is a new part of the regulation that was not there before because of new legal requirements that came about in requiring that staff do not assist individuals who have been suspected or alleged to engage in misconduct with students, assist them in seeking employment in other LEAs. And finally, one of the things we do want to do with we have what's called a discipline committee, which is made up of the Chief Human Capital Officer, Chief of Staff, Chief of Schools, Chief Legal Counsel, and advisory capacity on a quarterly basis to review the data that we have as far as staff interaction that we're looking at in this policy to ensure that looking at the demographics to look for trends and ensure the disciplinary recommendations are consistently applied from an equity standpoint. And then the discipline committee shall also review the yearly compliance report prior to it coming to the board. Stakeholder engagement, both the Office of Human Capital and Legal Counsel have been involved in updating the policy. The policy has been sent out to all of the bargaining units to give feedback to, because all bargaining units have employees who engage with students. I've already heard back from the board of the Piazza unit, specifically talking about making sure that they have the tools they need to reach out to students who have disappeared from school, or parents, to keep those individuals engaged and understanding that everyone is on the same page where they have the tools, but understanding what boundaries should be there in utilizing the tools and also informing the staff what they are. We also we'll reach out to the Parent Community Advisory Board as well as the Student Congress of Baltimore City. Suggestions, feedback, would appreciate it.
Great, thank you so much. And so I will set a target for us in terms of time for discussion and questions until about 4:45 for my other commissioners on the board. And so as we're asking questions so that we can share the airway a little bit. And so I wanted to start with Chief James, because we heard from Chief McFadden in the first round. I wanted to start with you to see if you had any questions or comments.
My only comment at this point would be that I completely am on board and agree that we can never imagine or list everything that might become a challenge or pop up. So creating a list of this is a violation, that's a violation is challenging. So I appreciate the ability that you have left thus far for this to be flexible to meet the needs of unfortunate circumstances that may arise that we may never have imagined. So I appreciate that, as well as the lens of supporting people in making the right choices rather than making incorrect choices. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner James. I think we also have Commissioner Sykes on the line as well. So Commissioner Sykes, did you have any thoughts or questions for members as well?
Good afternoon. I do not at this time, but thank you.
Awesome. And it's good to see you here and filling in for Chair Chinia. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Commissioner McFadden, do you have any questions?
Thank you, Dr. Brooks. And yes, it is certainly good to see Commissioner Sykes in the Policy Committee meeting. We are happy that he's joined us. That student voice is critical. So hopefully, Commissioner Sykes, after the presentation, I mean, of course, we'll still have more time for you to contribute, but please make sure that you do, because we certainly need to hear from you and your perspective. But with the policy, I would ask that on page 3 of the actual policy where it defines staff, that we include interns there. I know that there are volunteers specified and I think one other group. I think that we need to be explicit about interns. I think about interns that are in teaching or social work or whatever. And I know that their schools and their universities may have directions and ways to govern behavior and interaction, but I think that we should also house them in that umbrella as well, Mr. Jones. And I appreciate you for the presentation also. Another question that I have before that, well, and I would also ask that we are explicit about engaging the FOP. I know that you listed the different bargaining units that you've been reaching out to, but I just know that our school police officers have very unique relationships with our young people and generally positive relationships. And I just want to make sure that we get feedback directly from them on how this policy will support their work and the benefit of our young people.
Yeah, we did send it to them also. And so I'll reach out to Chief Ham and his team to make sure that we get feedback from them.
I appreciate that, Mr. Jones. And then finally, and the same thing with what is in the policy for interns to also be included in the regs too, because I think I saw that in the regulation where we define staff. I would encourage us to include interns there also. And then finally, my concern, I know that this is a policy that is focused on staff members, but what protections are in place or what protocols are in place, and should we be explicit about it in this policy for our staff when students are inappropriate or make inappropriate attempts or solicit inappropriate behavior from staff member, what protections do our staff members have? And are we going to define that or be explicit about that in policy? And that's my question. What about student misconduct with staff? Would it be in another policy? When I was referencing some of the other policies, of course, I went to the J's because the J's talk about the students. Now, I was looking at JICK or JKA. I'm not sure because I didn't go through them. But when a student is inappropriate, I know that we're talking about staff, but staff misconduct. But what happens if a student is inappropriate? What should teachers, staff members do? What protections do teachers and staff members have in that type of situation?
You know, that's a really, I appreciate that call out. That does come up from time to time. We have had investigations where staff have come forward and proactively, in some cases, concerned that the behavior might go too far and it appear improper from them. So yeah, that is not in here. And I think you're exactly right. We'll have to go to JICK, some of the J policies, and see if there is something in there. And if not, we'll have to think through how to make sure that staff know if they are being engaged in situations which they feel are inappropriate coming from a student, you know, what recourse should they take?
I think that's important, Mr. Johnson.
Yes.
I appreciate you mentioning that because in the policy I did see how we identify who a student is, right? And we talk about under the age 18 and under, but then if you are a student, because we do know that we have young people that are in our school system that are students above the age of 18. And so I just want to make sure that we identify protections and protocols and plans of action for when students are inappropriate. What protects our staff and what is the process for them being supported in that event. So I appreciate you noting that, Mr. Jones. That's it for me, Dr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner McFadden, for those questions. There are a couple of things that came up for me. Partly, I'll start with trying to get a good sense around the policy, and it seems like it was incorporating some pieces, additional pieces that were actually like language around grooming, which is really specific to sex trafficking and exploitation of children, and sort of the inclusion of that particular language. The bigger sort of notice, and hopefully that we'll see in there, like that training then becomes really, really important, especially with those new particular pieces. And so like sort of more specificity around what that time frame and that structure looks like, and accountability processes to make sure that our staff are fully trained and aware and capable. And you know, I didn't know if also the language around grooming was you know, just was intentionally signaling about those particular dynamics, but I just know some of the sex trafficking literature and so that's usually in the same category. And so I really appreciate Commissioner McFadden's question and the ask around the FOP, because this would also be a touch point for them there. Let's see what I have in my notes. One of the things that, again, that Commissioner James had mentioned many, many moons ago, that I think it applies to this particular conversation as well, is, again, what is appropriate touch and sort of like behaviors, because I know we saw some language in this as well. And so when things are particularly subjective, how to, again, do we sort of, you know, so it's not just a body part, but like, how do we get more specific about sort of what that might look like, and given the nuance of that. So I just kind of wanted to raise that again as I was reviewing this, and it seemed appropriate as well. And let's see. I think Commissioner, we talked about volunteers, and what else do we have here? Sex trafficking. I think also some language, and I think we talk about sort of like what's professional, and I know that breadth, there's going to be a breadth of sort of what that looks like in terms of sort of professional behaviors. One of the things that my overarching sort of big thought about this policy was that when I was reading through it, it felt like, minus the specific pieces that are around like, don't do this because this is sexual harassment, but like things like riding in cars with teachers or like doing all of these things, some of it seemed, and I can't tell if it was just my sort of hovering in the back of my head, that some of these things are probably actually happening, like folks providing resources or monies to children in need. So in some ways, I know that this is real. And so I'm really also looking forward to feedback from teachers and sort of how this might either be an easy sell, or it might be more challenging just because the practices of supporting some of our students requires a little bit more intentionality that actually might now be considered inappropriate behavior. And so I don't know if there's any single thing that I'm sort of saying with that idea, but it just felt like around the texting and the social media and all of these new platforms, in many ways, could very well be happening. And what does that do, especially when we think about engagement and trying to reach our students now? Like, what are appropriate mechanisms to do that if we're hunting and trying to get folks to be in the classroom or be sign up for their virtual learning? And we know that teachers are usually the front line for doing some of that work. So that's a piece there. And I guess the last thing that I'll note, and I see your hand, Commissioner James, so I'll come to you right after this, was let's see, taking subjective meaning. The piece around, there was some language in there, and so my question now is around sort of dual roles, right? So we know what teachers are doing, but if they have volunteer capacity working at community-based organizations where they have different roles and standards, how might this impact them in terms of working with the same students in our district, right? And so we know we have some folks literally having programs that are made up of our students, and just want to have some thought and attention to sort of what type of rubs that might sort of create, if any at all. And Commissioner James?
Thank you. I think it's always interesting the language we use. So what kind of rubs would we have with this policy? Oops. To pull off a couple pieces that when Dr. Brooks was speaking reminded me that we have a differentiation within our faculty and staff. Again, not just of those teacher roles. So I might be a teacher during the day, you might be my class, and I might be leading your Girl Scout troop on the weekend. Then where does that boundary fall as far as me giving you a ride home? But specifically around in the regulations to be considerate of what we're going to do about professional development. How are we going to communicate this information systematically and streamlined so that it gets to the different bodies that need to hear this message? And specifically, how will we differentiate that training for paraprofessionals and coaches? So those are two groups of people who tend to have different kinds of intimacy relationships with young people. Paraprofessionals are toileting students. They may be, working with changing feeding tubes or showering students. So they would need to have sort of different guidelines that still protect them and protect students while allowing them to do the daily job. And then around the idea of coaches, and maybe within coaching falls anyone who's an after-school provider, because it is very hard as an adult to drive away from a school and have 6 kids waiting for the bus. Do you wait with them? Is it just easier to throw them in your car and drop them off at home? So what is the guidance around sort of peripheral school servicing and the adults that are in staffing positions in those spaces? Again, so that we can be transparently clear as well as fair, so that we're supporting our teachers, supporting our paraprofessionals, our coaches, and our volunteers. At the same time, we're also meeting the needs of our students that are very real around transportation and things like that. So those would be my additional highlights. Thank you.
Thank you. And so, okay, I see Chief Skinner, your comment in the, so thank you, the grooming elements of the policy. Yes, and I'm assuming that they also come with some specific content around like, or some things that should be covered as to make sure to see and understand what that is, and so that we can interrupt it and make sure that grooming is not occurring in our spaces and of employment. So thank you there. Any other questions before we sort of transition that came up?
Dr. Brooks.
Yeah.
Very quickly, it has nothing to do with this policy, but since we have Chief Grant Skinner here, when Dr. James mentioned the paraprofessionals, I had a thought about where we are right now, Chief Grant Skinner, and this is something for later, but since you're here, I just feel like I'm going to ask. We have some bus drivers and we have food service workers that are building really strong connections with our students and our families. I'm curious to know if we have started to consider pathways for them to go into the classroom. And I know that this is a different conversation. I know that Ashley Stewart presented on that a little while ago, but it was just a thought that I had when Commissioner James mentioned the paraprofessionals and the relationships that some of our staff members are having now. I don't want to take up a lot of time, but it was just a thought that I had. And I'm just curious to know if we have a plan, if that is something in the larger scheme of things to support those members of our community and being more present in our school buildings beyond their current scope of responsibility. And I see that the Chief of Staff is also unmuted. Dr. Brooks, I did not want to take up time, so I'm just saying.
So all I'm gonna say is 2 minutes. Y'all got 2 minutes. I said we got 45.
I just want to add one quick thing onto Commissioner McFadden's thought, which maybe this is where it's coming from, but I wasn't sure, is that through the student learning centers where we've had bus aides and bus drivers, Proctor, that there's been a number of individuals who through that experience have really identified that that is the work they want to be doing, that they want to be in classrooms, they want to be para educators. And so we've been trying to work out how to make those opportunities available. That's like one of the best news stories I love about those student learning centers is that. So I will turn to Jeremy about how we're trying to make that those opportunities available.
And Chief Grant, doesn't have to be now. You can send it to me because I don't want to make my chair upset this afternoon.
I think I can answer you and not upset your chair by just saying exactly. I anticipated this is where it was coming from. Also, Dr. Santelices has also shared, the interest that she heard directly from folks who were assigned to student learning centers who had not considered student-facing roles like that before. And at a minimum, we know that we're going to be connecting with them, folks who've served in that role over the last few months to see if they have interest in that and talk to them about the Parapro assessment in particular, which is the quickest way for someone to be able to qualify to serve as a paraeducator.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Dr. Brooks. And look, you still have time left.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that presentation. And we're going to go ahead and shift to our last item, which will be FFA, naming and renaming of school facilities. And I think, all of the policies or outlines of discussions that come before us are really important. And I know that as we sit in this particular social context, where the pervasiveness of racism is sort of being elevated for some people, as well as sort of being a spotlight put on it, like the presentation has really important information around sort of how we begin to grapple with the legacies and the histories of systemic inequalities and particularly systematic racism, but then also to make sure that when we're choosing names that we have a process that actually supports the equitable renaming of those schools. So I want to pass the mic over for the discussion.
Okay, good afternoon, Board of Commissioners. I'm Angela Alvarez. I'm the Executive Director of the Office of New Initiatives. I want to ask Josh to go ahead and introduce himself.
Hi, Josh Sivan, Chief Legal Officer.
And Josh, I don't know if you want to give a brief overview just of the everybody that's we're working with on this before we get into the presentation really quickly.
Sure. This has been already starting a true cross-functional effort, and we have Teresa Jones and her team from OAA here joining us and ready to answer questions, as well as Tracy Durant and her team from the Equity Office. And we've had involvement from the Academics Office and Christina Ross, who's, without stealing the one of the important parts of this, is going to do a little bit about the role that Be More Me is going to play in this work. There are others as well that are really important as we're trying to think about mobilizing. And I think this presentation, like the one that Chief Hike Hubbard presented, is really, again, in the theme of coming to you with a presentation where policy work, if we need policy work, is down the road. But first, we're framing this up and trying to be community facing at the front. So Angela, do you want to kick us off?
Yep. And so the key thing that I think is an important tenet and important goal of the work is this belief that all of our school names should actually honor the dignity and aspirations of our broader school community, and in particular our students, and that their voices should be empowered in the process around school naming. Next slide. And so the first thing we want to just kind of ground in our existing policy, which is Board Policy FFA, that's around naming and renaming of a school program. And so, you know, it sets some criteria around school names when they're named after persons, that it must be a person who is not living and a person who has a record of service that is distinguished and documented. I think another thing that's important and unique about the work of city schools that goes back in time, this goes back to kind of, you know, at a time when we had segregated schools. We have a history of school names that commemorate important African Americans who've contributed to our world in profound ways, not just on the national level, which you see in a lot of school districts, but also very local people who may not be remembered today as the intent of the name. So you may not even know that some of our school names are named after important educators, for example, Black educators who are doing the work in our community. Elmer Henderson is a good example of that. And so maintaining that history and sort of reclaiming that history as part of this work, as we also look to do some corrections around names that are problematic and don't have that same kind of esteem. The policy, you know, requires that schools that are considering new names actually revisit the list of names that have closed. We've been doing a lot of change work in this district, and that can sometimes result in erasure of some of that history. And so really being intentional on how we revisit those names are important. I think it's the next slide. To give an example of some of what I was talking about, those local connections, and that we have Frederick Douglass, which, you know, that's not unusual. A lot of districts have schools named after Frederick Douglass. He's our most famous resident, but it's important. And the school itself is important in terms of history, being the second oldest U.S. high school created for Black students that is in continued operation. But we have other people that may not be as well known, like Dr. Nathan Pitts, who, you know, was a diplomat. He was like the first diplomat that was part of UNESCO. Or Mary Rodman, who was an educator and was part of Baltimore's first graduating class for Black students. And then probably very well-known Lily May, Carol Jackson, who's a civil rights activist. So we have a mix of like local people of local import and or more nationally well-known that I think is important to preserve. What we've been doing over the most recent years around annual review, as well as the work that 21st Century does, has been reviewing existing names on a case-by-case basis. So like last Tuesday, the board approved about a week ago that process for our Edgecombe community, where they rename parts of their buildings to reclaim some of the history from their schools. We're currently working with 21st Century with the Calverton and Mosher communities around kind of revisiting names. So that's been happening on a case-by-case basis currently. Next slide. And so this is an example of like work 21st Century team has done. Like we had a school, you know, that was named, you know, after like a revolutionary general, and then renaming it so it's named after Dorothy I. Height. And that was a process that had was centered in student feedback as well as community feedback and the selection of that name. Students had debates, like it was a whole really powerful process, you know, that changed that name, you know, from Wagnall Heights to Dorothy I. Height, which I think was an important example of how this work should look. Next. And so the process that's set in policy, you know, starts with basically a form or a submission to OAA. It can be submitted by a school community or a CEO designee. So it can be initiated by anyone in the school community. It then needs to get approval from the CEO or the school leader in order to move forward. In terms of how the current process works, the community must be part of that process. And by community, that means students, school-based staff, community partners that work with that school, and the broader community. So really ensuring there's a full, rich engagement process that involves the whole school community. It can last several months to make sure there's really wide engagement and really thinking through the name. Then that's shared in a public meeting and the board votes, very much like with the Edgecombe, the most recent thing that's before you guys as a board. You can get to the next slide. And so some more specific examples of community renaming. Again, we talked about, I just talked about the Edgecombe community who merged with Dr. Martin Luther King. And so, you know, they had that process that lasted about 4 to 6 months. It was part of also how we bring the two school communities together and just making sure that we're preserving the history of the people that we intend to honor, as well as the history of schools. There's a lot of our history as city schools that's embedded in these processes. We did a similar process the year prior with the Gilmore and Penderhughes community, bringing them together. And making sure there's wide representation from, again, all of stakeholders in that process. So that's an example of work in process. Next slide. And so this just breaks down what that process could look like. So it starts with initial surveying. So you get a broad list of names before it's narrowed down. So it doesn't start with like, here are the 3 names we think. It starts very broad. And that initial survey and just talking to people about rethinking the name and getting ideas. And then there's meetings that are attended. So we set up forums. We attend meetings with the school community. So back to school nights. If there's chat and choose that happen, meetings with community partners at existing meetings they have. So just making sure there's like this full touch of all stakeholders and is broadly advertised in every way that we can. The voting typically takes about 2 to 3 weeks to give community members a chance to vote. It's usually done even before COVID digitally, whereas online voting, as well as being able to turn in paper ballots. With students, you know, voting in their classrooms. A lot of teachers have really maximized this to be an instructional point. So like with Edgecombe, they aligned it to the election process. So it allowed them to kind of talk about that in concert with a you know, that citizenship and that kind of advocacy at the same time. So it lends itself quite strongly to those processes. And then that the transition committee that's made of those stakeholders validate and count the votes and submit the final request for board approval. Next slide.
So the process that Angela set out, and really the forefront nature of the work that we've done as city schools, has also had a context beyond city schools where in some ways the rest of the country and the world is catching up with us and our focus on names, but I think has also galvanized us about the importance of names and commemoration in our work. And so we just wanted to situate this work in that broader context while also recognizing the important role we've played, the long history we've had. So just to situate, starting locally, lots of increased focus on who deserves monuments and by extension, schools named after them in our community. So as you all recall, in 2017, the city of Baltimore removed a number of monuments connected with the Confederacy, as well as the statue to Chief Justice Roger Taney, who wrote the notorious decision in Dred Scott, which was really one of the low points in the Supreme Court's history. At that same time, Baltimore City Public Schools, again at the forefront, city schools teachers mobilized as part of the Be More Me curriculum to really focus on who deserves a monument as part of our curriculum for our students, really looking at some of these issues about who do we commemorate, who do we celebrate. And then recently, last summer, Baltimoreans mobilized to topple a statue to Christopher Columbus, and continues to be very much at the forefront of our work. And then to shift more broadly to a national context on the next slide, there have been, and we had a great intern that helped us with some of the research in my office, who happened to be a former city schools teacher who's now a student at Georgetown Law School, Brandon McLean. I wanted to give him a acknowledgement for this work. He looked at the work that's been accelerating really after the police killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others to reevaluate names across the nation. And so here are just some of the school districts we've looked at, and you see they range all over the country, ranging from large urbans to some of our other colleagues. And we looked at a variety of these, and really in the next couple slides summarize the work that's been done in some other school districts. So a particular focus on school names, just like the monuments we mentioned in Baltimore, school names connected to the Confederacy. So school names connected to commemorating individuals with those ties. And here are just some examples that Jeb Stuart, who was a Confederate general high school in Fairfax County, has been renamed Justice High School. And Charlotte Mecklenburg, Zebulon Vance, another Confederate, was renamed after Julius Chambers, who's one of the leaders of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund that worked along with Thurgood Marshall on the Brown versus Board of Education decision. In Houston, Sidney Lanier Middle School, another Confederate leader, renamed after Bob Lanier, who happens to have the same name but was a mayor more recently in the city. And then Robert E. Lee Elementary School, another example in Oklahoma City, renamed after Adelaide Lee, who was a local activist in that community. Then we've also seen names connected to white supremacy being featured as communities elsewhere in the country, really looking at those names. So nearby in Montgomery County, Colonel Edward Brooke Lee, who was an active supporter of racially exclusionary housing practices. That school has been renamed just recently after Odessa Shannon, who was one of the first African-American woman to serve on the Board of Education in Montgomery County. And then another example is in Topeka, Kansas, Seaman High School, named after Ku Klux Klan leaders, in the process of being renamed. And the other area where we're seeing focus is on school names connected to slavery. Elected officials, politicians, and generals who, like John Eager Howard, who Angela mentioned earlier, owned enslaved persons. So ranging from, and here are just some examples, in Albany, there's been a focus on Philip Schuyler Achievement Academy, named after a Revolutionary War general, senator, and the father-in-law of Alexander Hamilton, is being put through a process of looking at that name. Berkeley, California is looking at schools named after Presidents Washington and Jefferson, who were both owners of enslaved people. And then another example is in Detroit, Cass Technical High School is named after a former governor of Michigan, who was also Senator and Secretary of State, who enforced the Indian Removal Act, which paved the way for the really notorious Trail of Tears. So those are just, we wanted to put those examples out there as the context more broadly for what other school districts are doing. As in those efforts across the country, like in city schools, community voice is a big part of the process. And so I mentioned Topeka, Kansas, that was focused on students really being at the forefront. And I think that's an emphasis in our work, but I think important as this process as well, that was students who advocated for the change following student research done that uncovered documents connecting this individual to the KKK. And then in Tyler, Texas, the real impetus behind changing the name and reconsidering the name of Robert E. Lee High School, as well as John Tyler High School, was students highlighting the impact on students and especially student athletes who wear uniforms with their school name, and how wearing that school name and having that on your clothing, that really impacts and very evident, but really poignant in the testimony that those students made before the Tyler, Texas board about what it meant to a student, an African-American student, other students of color, to have a name associated with a Confederate general being the name you are represented as your school. So that is a really important theme that we want to keep in this work. And then also, I think, recognizing that names are a focus and are controversial. So there have been voices from all sides of this perspective. If we've looked at it, Virginia's governor has really pushed the state of Virginia and all the school districts to reconsider names connected to the Confederacy, with a quote that we put here: "Now is the time to change the names to reflect the inclusive, diverse, and welcoming school community every child deserves." But also some voices, including the mayor of San Francisco and others, asking about why it's important to prioritize naming when there are other issues, including responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. So just recognizing that this area is definitely highly contested space. We also looked at models at the university level, recognizing that universities and university communities have been in the forefront, and those range from close to home, Towson University, where students have mounted petitions to dorms named after William Paca and Charles Carroll, who were signers of the Declaration of Independence and also slave owners, to Oregon State, which has changed the name of a building commemorating a federal judge and university leader who helped draft the first state constitution that barred African Americans from living in Oregon, a part of the history that we outside of Oregon don't know well, but truly a terrible part of our past. Yale University changing the name of a college named after John C. Calhoun, who was a prominent defender of slave owning, and then Princeton renaming Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, with the focus on Woodrow Wilson's real contribution, unfortunately, to resegregating the civil service and the armed forces during his presidency. And then there are a number, we found in particular that we wanted to flag as we're starting to consider this work, a policy at UNC in Chapel Hill, just looking at this, which really walked through and is worth considering as our other policies, but just the nuance of names, and so how to look at names. And so this we provided as an interesting case study of, so they have a sort of spectrum of name changing. and considering of names, where the requests for removing is stronger or weightier when there's a serious violation of law, where the repugnant conduct was central to the person's career, and where honoring the person, continuing to honor the person, jeopardizes the integrity and the mission of the university. On the other hand, they, and this is just one perspective, we're not necessarily endorsing this, we just want to continue to consider all perspectives, think a request is not as strong when the namesake's offensive behavior or viewpoints were conventional during their life, where other aspects of their life or work were more noteworthy, and when there was evolution over time of the namesake's behavior. So these are just factors that we think that as we go forward with this work, will be important to think about. So that's the background. We've given you the local context. We've given you the national context.
Yeah.
And
Chief Seven, I'll give you all 3 more minutes so we can have some more robust conversation.
Absolutely. So we just wanted to frame this up that the goals of this, of what we want to do in terms of reviewing names, are to really document, maintain, and display the history of city schools' names, and really make sure that our school communities understand the names and are engaged with the names of their schools and making meaning there. Also align our policy on school naming to our equity work, and to create a more robust process for considering names of previously existing schools, as Angela referenced, and then also really focusing on piloting with a specific set of school communities so we can do deep engagement work. We've put up what our initial draft at some potential guiding questions for city schools as we consider names. We can come back to this, but in the interest of time, I'll go past this. And then we want to center students and students' voices in this process. So if I may, Commissioner Brooks, quickly turn over to Christina Ross to really to briefly talk about the work that Be More Me is going to do as part of this. Christina, can you briefly share what you're working on?
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here with you tonight. I'm really excited about this. The Be More Me team is pulling together a fellowship that will have hopefully between 10 and 15 students, and hopefully 3 to 4 teachers, who will be working over the course of the spring to examine the criteria for naming schools, and this will be grounded in some of the Who Deserves a Monument curriculum, and then doing some research to understand the backgrounds of folks for whom schools are currently named, and we're partnering with Enoch Pratt on that, and then we are also working with the AFRO to provide students with an opportunity to highlight and share some of the their learning and their research on people who they think we need to elevate their history and legacy more. And then we'll be looking at how schools are currently incorporating the legacy of the individuals for whom their schools are named in the school culture, like through curriculum or anything like that, if they are at all. And I'll pass it back to Josh.
And then I think we have one more slide here that to build on that work, here are our next steps. We're going to get into 6 minutes, I promise. This is the initial presentation. That's steps 1. And Christina emphasized that really student-centered work that we're going to do. We're going to do a series of other engagements as well during the period. And then we're going to come back to the policy committee in April with a redefined set of guiding questions, identification of policy regulation implications that we may want to change if there are any, a status report on the research we've done through the help of our students and broader, and an update on an engagement process with the goal to both do policy work if we need to, and also to, during the 21-22 school year, pilot with a set of schools to look deeply at the names of those schools and their implications to center equity in our naming processes. So I know that was a lot, and thank you for bearing with us. And we have a whole team here that's part of this work that we're really excited to bring together on this critical and important work.
Awesome. Just want to say, thank you for the presentation and all the incredibly important information. And I think it is the time, if there ever was one, to be engaging in a process of thinking about what this means for us and how do we begin to address in many ways systemic inequalities. And so I just want to thank Angela, Josh, and Christina for the presentation. And wanted to open up. I wanted to leave some time for us to actually discuss this, the framing and the outline of this naming policy. And so, do we have any folks with questions or comments that we wanted to jump in? Commissioner Sykes, I see you. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you all for the presentation. I want to reflect on slide 20, potential guiding questions for city schools, and we didn't get a chance to really look at it. But the first point, which was, should the board broaden its reevaluation criteria to prohibit naming schools for individuals whose conduct and or views are inconsistent with the city schools' commitment to racial equity set forth in policy ADA. Individuals with ties to the Confederacy, slave owning and advocacy to racial, I'm not gonna lie, I really cannot pronounce this word. Epitriad, I apologize, I might have messed it up. And if so, what should the process for changing existing names be? So what I do want to say is, I think as a board that we should reevaluate the criteria prohibiting these names, because we can't put up a policy that says that we will, the things that we want to protect and how we view people and view because what we say about people and how the compliance, just the ensuring the access and representation of academic and people, period. And I think that will come in conflict with, okay, this is what we put and say we have policy ADA, but then when we go to a school could possibly be named after someone who was a slave owner or who was a part of the Confederacy.
Yeah. Thank you much, Commissioner Sykes. Thank you. Commissioner James, did you have thoughts or feedback, reflections?
No, I'm glad that we're doing this. When we first looked at this policy 2 or 3 years ago, we knew that this was going to be an addendum we were going to need to address. At that time, there wasn't the capacity the policy needed to get out and get going. But I appreciate that it's happening at this point. I would also like to take, and this is far less reported and far harder information to garner, but powerful people tend to have a habit of being people who take advantage of folks for reasons beyond enslavement, and also including. So looking to the extent that we can at how they treated their wives and their children, or their partners and their children. What we don't want to do is promote domestic abuse or those kinds of things as well. Much harder to document, but in looking comprehensively at considering even encouraging schools to name themselves after things that would be, far more permanent in the less controversy as things change, if that makes sense. Naming by geographic location or landmark rather than by person. As an option to make sure that as life evolves and as we learn to be more aware and more responsive to the needs of community, that we're not in need of sort of continuous revision, if that makes sense.
And I think that will be the important tensions that I think we want to surface in this process of examining, because I think that, as Angela pointed out, there have been some really important long history in this district of elevating names of really important community members and holding on to those names, educators, activists. And so what position we take at names after geographic places versus names after individuals. And then even one of the pieces that we did in the guiding questions, thinking about schools that happen to be named after neighborhoods that happen to be named after people, and what are the implications there more broadly for our city and our schools versus communities, and also what's the important role of the local community? Should we be taking positions as a district that say we don't want a name that features X or Y criteria, which are very important criteria, and if the community says we really think our name's important, what's the role of community voice, student voice in that process, and how do we elevate that and recognize this? Or are there certain things that are non-negotiable no matter what? And I think those are hard decisions that we'll have to work through.
Yeah, and additionally, I think in the regulations needing to address the role of the fact that we have school names, we also have the buildings they're housed in named something else. And that is, many times they're buildings that are not actually our buildings, they're city buildings. So where are the roles and responsibilities? Where does the line draw between who can and should change a building name and under what conditions, if it, depending on the occupancy arrangements?
Commissioner McFadden, did you have any thoughts? I know that he had to step away for a second, so I'm not sure if he's back yet.
I did step away. I'm back. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm not sure if I'm able to hear Dr. Durant. I don't know if she's chimed in, but I know that she's here. I'm eager to hear Dr. Durant's thoughts around this work. I know that she also is a product of city schools and of this community. So I'm curious to know if Dr. Durant is able to chime in a little bit.
Hi, Commissioner McFadden. Can you hear me?
I can. How are you, Dr. Durant?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm okay.
Could you do me a favor and just repeat your question?
I just wanted to get your thoughts on this process as we've, undergone the renaming and just your framing as our equity director. I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are around this process. And in addition to the questions that we had listed on the final slide, is there anything else that we should be considering as school board members as we move forward with this process?
So I think the timing of your question is actually perfect. So one of the things that, can you hear me? Because you all are frozen on my screen. Okay, great. So one of the things that I would say, and I think Angela and Joshua also alluded to this, is that we have been working together and having these conversations. And one of the things that we are going to make certain to do as part of our cross-functional work is going to be to use our guiding questions for the application of an equity lens. And so you may remember, commissioners, that we teed this up for you when we did our last update, and we've been working with offices. You heard Jessica Lawrence earlier reference the use of the guiding questions in their deliberations. And so one of the things that I think will help all of us, particularly those of you who are our commissioners, is when we are able to show you how we are planning to use those questions for your own deliberations. And so I think while we have been in policy committee meeting today, Christian has already reached out, and he and Chidamawe Mwanda, the manager in our office, are coordinating time for us to do that work together. So that by the time this comes back to policy committee, we will also already have been through that process of going through these guiding questions. And so we'll be using the same process both in our renaming cross-functional team and with the school board commissioner. So we will be in alignment as our policy has indicated that we should be.
I appreciate that, Dr. Durant. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
That's it for me, Dr. Brooks.
Awesome. So I think, one of the things that kind of stood out for me, again, always, Chief Seven, as you know, everybody knows, what about the LGBT folks? How do we get folks in? How do we understand sort of the role of Black queer folks in shaping Baltimore history? And sort of how do we sort of attend to that is, always a question and a wondering for me as a commissioner. And, I think the conversation and how we begin to sort of go through the legacies and histories, and I don't know if this is just my particular orientation, but I think as you're having conversations and framing this up, again, I think it was, I don't remember what slide, but how do we handle that tension? So I'm not one to just say I want the name removed for the name's removed sake. I want a recognition that that was there and that we made an intentional decision to change it because the history was so violent and antithetical to the mission of our work. Because for me, erasing the fact that really toxic and terrible and dehumanizing things happened allows people to forget how far we've come and how far we still have to go in terms of trying to get this work done. And so for me, I think, and hopefully, they might be different, and I want to make sure we get the community input, and around that is that like and maybe to try to as many ways to attend to that nuance, because I need to know that terrible things happened here, and I need to know that we made a choice, and that our choice was equitable, and we had an equity lens in frame in our mind, and that we were committed to that. So I just wanted to flag that as a point of mine.
Yeah, it's important. Like part of what we talked about is documenting sort of the history of city schools so it lives in a public facing way, and would include those pieces so that when we are acknowledging where we went wrong and what we have learned in that process, and it doesn't erase our wrong that occurred as if it didn't happen. It acknowledges that it did, and then how we corrected it. So that's all part of what we will be attending to, and keep us honest in that.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Commissioner Brooks, may I respond to that as well?
Totally.
And so to your point, I think one of the things, as you all know, certainly in our equity policy, but also in our seminar that we talk about is like this historical context of race and the impact of Baltimore. And to your point, I've often said to folks that we are invested in the lies we like to tell ourselves about who we are. And so just changing the name and not being very, very deliberate and explicit and intentional about the why we did that. So when folks who are not us who will be sitting in these seats, it will be very clear that Baltimore City Schools and the school board made a very deliberate decision to do this so that we could, be honoring the humanity of our students and families. And I think to your earlier point about our LGBTQ community or the queer community, as you referenced, I think the other thing that is also happening at the same time is our cross-functional team around LGBTQ. And one of the things that Josh and I in particular have really committed to is making sure that we are elevating the multiple perspectives so that we make sure that we're not missing something in that process. So you should know that those two things are happening at the same time. And I think it will certainly put us, well situated to be able to respond in an appropriate way.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Duran. I appreciate all of that commentary and Angela, and I keep forgetting folks' titles. I'm sorry. And for the additional commentary as well. And so I think for me, that was all that I had. We're, again, just deeply appreciative of the space and the time. And it looks like there might be someone else's hand. And so, Ms. Lauren, I think you're on.
Yes, I'm sorry, I had it on mute.
Oh.
I just want to add just one thing to this discussion. I'm listening to what everybody's saying, and I agree with it, in terms of the importance of this work. In around 2003, I was personally involved in it because I was a principal at what used to be Lake Clifton High School, and the school was broken up into 3 parts. And 2 of the parts, one was named Thurgood Marshall, one was named Doris M. Johnson. Doris M. Johnson was an East Baltimore person of political bent or a community person. And my school was named Heritage High School. And I wanted to name the school African American Heritage High School, but that didn't go very well. So we stuck with Heritage. But once those schools were closed, it's something left. The kids no longer had their school, the school they could identify with. So we have graduates of Thurgood Marshall High School. We got graduates of Darcy M. Johnson. We have graduates of Heritage, and they no longer have an identity to those schools. And if you think about it, school names didn't change as much as they did, once these new ideas came about making small learning communities and doing that kind of stuff. So my mother graduated from Frederick Douglass. She was born in 1911. So I just think that we just have to be very, very careful when we decide to, name a school and then the school disappears. So I just think that it means a lot. The Lake Clifton Alumni Association was one of the strongest alumni associations that ever existed. When Lake Clifton was broken up into the 3 smaller schools, that alumni association now had 3 different names. They stuck with it. But now there's one school left in that, in that setting. That's the Reach Partnership. So they still exist, but having been through that and witnessed the anxiety and the pain of, losing the name of your school and so forth and so on, I just think that I just wanted to say that I think that this should be done, but I think that we just need to be, I heard Tracy use the word deliberate, because once we decide we're going to name a school, we got to consider that we want to keep that school with that name, and not, when something comes along, then we decide that we need to change the name. So that's all I wanted to say.
Great, thank you so much for that, and I appreciate your reflection and the importance of naming. And Chief Sivan and everyone else, it made me think about sort of if there is a role for those alumni of those schools,
yes,
and to think about sort of what that is as someone who went to a school that no longer has its name.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just wonder, and so looking forward to see what folks think about that and some of the feedback and so forth. And so we are just about at time, and I just want to thank everybody for attending and the rich conversation, the sharing of perspectives. Christian, am I missing anything before I start reading out the next meeting notes, upcoming meeting and things?
No, you're not, Commissioner.
Awesome, thank you so much. And so I just want to remind folks that advanced sign up is permitted only beginning at 9 a.m. on Thursdays before our public meetings, at 5 p.m. The Monday before. Individuals or groups interested in providing comments to the committee may also sign up in 3 ways. You can contact our board office, and you can email our board office as well. And our phone number is 443-984-2000. And then, of course, our email is schoolboard@bcps.k12.md.us. We just kind of want to, again, thank everybody. We'd love to, we didn't have any public comments tonight. And so would love to, of course, have more people participate in that spot, in that space as well. And if there's any questions or concerns that you have, you can also, again, reach out to the board office. Our next meeting is scheduled for January the 19th at 3:30 p.m. It will also be virtual. We will be discussing policy JKA, student discipline. And with that, I will close this policy committee meeting.
Commissioner, if I could add one. On January 7th, and Joe also flagged this, there'll be a board forum around the family and community engagement policy. Just reminding members of the public to come hear some more information and a chance to engage with the board around the development of the policy.
Great. So wonderful.
And Dr. Brooks.
Yes, Commissioner McFadden.
I don't know if we will be all together prior to Dr. James's birthday next week, but I do want to make sure that as a committee, we wished her a happy early birthday. Her birthday is next Thursday.
Yay, happy early birthday, Commissioner James.
Thank you. My cat wants to be in the film today. I'm like pushing her away. Thank you very much. And I hope everyone has a safe and happy holiday.
Absolutely. Everybody, good night, everyone. We'll see you later, and Happy New Year.